Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Tindal. I am the Executive Director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, where our mission is to foster curiosity and a spirit of discovery in visitors of all ages, enhancing public understanding of and appreciation for the natural world, science, and human cultures. This mission in mind, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to tonight's book conversation sponsored by the Harvard Museum of Natural History. We are delighted to have Dr. Beronda Montgomery with us tonight to talk about her book, Lessons from Plants, published in 2021 by Harvard University Press. During the program, we will also be raffling 3 copies of this wonderful book, courtesy of Harvard University Press. So stay tuned and you may be one of those lucky winners. Dr. Montgomery is MSU Foundation Professor of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology and Microbiology and Molecular Genetics at Michigan State University, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Academy of Microbiology, and the American Society of Plant Biologists. She was named one of Cell's 100 Inspiring Black Scientists in America and was the winner of the 2021 Cynthia Westcott Scientific Writing Award. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Montgomery to the Zoom stage.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here with us, Beronda. I have to tell you, I have read your book twice and fell in love with it, both personally and intellectually. And with that, I kind of want to begin to talk a bit about how your book sort of landed on me, and I imagine others. In my view, Lessons from Plants is a scientific meditation on the dynamism and the complex behaviors of plants and their value and sort of place within the larger ecosystems that we all belong to. But what also makes this book so special, in my opinion, is the didactic contours, the personal narrative that invites a level of insider view, right, of this incredible book and of your research. And so I wanted to begin by asking, what motivated you to write Lessons from Plants?
It's a great question. Thank you so much for sharing your impression of the book, first of all. It's always heartwarming to hear when it's landed well with the reader. Lessons from Plants, the topic came up before the book. So I had started using Lessons from Plants in some of my conversations in leadership context, and I had written a paper in 2018 for the Public Philosophy Journal on Lessons from Plants, on mentoring. And I started pursuing the lessons from plants really out of a frustration, a passion, a desire to have difficult conversations about my place as a Black woman in science, about racism, sexism, and other isms that we encounter in the academy and in the world. And frequently when we have those conversations, if we start from the human perspective of our interactions, people's defenses go up. If I'm talking to a white male colleague, he assumes I'm about to call him racist soon, or I'm about to assume that he's sexist. And so really looking at other ways that biological organisms show up in the world was a way to have difficult conversations and get deep in the conversation before our human defenses showed up. And so the lessons really started there. But I also realized that as I was sharing the lessons, people were getting charmed by the plant biology. And I love plants. I just think they are some of our most amazing kin on the planet. And so I realized it was an opportunity for me to share true plant knowledge in an accessible way and to have some deep and meaningful conversations. And ultimately, Lessons from Plants really evolved into my unique perspective as a Black woman plant biologist. I think of it as a Black feminist perspective on plant biology. If I think about Black feminism as ways of thinking about, as Patricia Hill Collins used to talk about, us having an outsider within perspective, right? And that showing up from that perspective, you're re-envisioning yourself you're re-envisioning community and family, but also the environments and ecosystems in which we exist. And so in some ways, for me, lessons from plants became a unique way for me to describe what plant biology has meant to me and how I hope to use it in the world to further our understanding of plants, but also our understanding of ourselves on the planet.
Oh, that's amazing. Building on your response, I wondered if you could, perhaps talk a bit about who's your audience. You marry both the science and the personal in a way that creates this really synergistic discussion. But who do you imagine being your audience?
So I have found an audience much broader than I imagined, which I'm grateful for. But as I was imagining the audience when I wrote it, I imagined my mother and my maternal ancestors, because I come from a family where when I got my degree, my mom said, we got our degree. When I got my job, she said, we got our job. It's always been that you don't show up alone. You show up as a part of an ancestral lineage. And so I wanted to write this book to invite my family, my mother, my family into my life. I'm the only professor in the family that I'm aware of, the only practicing plant scientist. And I really wanted them to understand my passion, my enthusiasm for plants in a way that they can embrace. And also because my mother loves plants so deeply, I also wanted to give her a chance to share some of the knowledge that I had learned about plants that she had come to intuitively, but to share all of the lessons that I had learned. So it was family. I also wanted the book to serve other plant biologists who may want to invite those in their circle. So I wanted other plant biologists to read it and see true plant biology, but written in an accessible enough a way that they could hand it to a friend or family member who they had always wanted to be invited in. And then my goal always is anybody who shares my enthusiasm for the natural world, I wanted to invite them into it. I always try to lead with my enthusiasm, not facts. And so I really tried to write the book to invite others who might have an enthusiasm for plants to join me in my enthusiasm, and then to say, oh, look, but all these cool facts I know, I want you to know those as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. You really take us on a journey. And the book almost feels like what the field of literature calls a Bildungsroman, this sort of journey, that's didactic, where you are vulnerable in a particular way in terms of thinking through your own encounters with plant. And often your mother, your father, your community shows up in some really unique ways. Can you talk about sort of the germ of your fascination or your enchantment with plants? Because it's so well interwoven into even the dedication page.
Yes.
It's so ripe with that sort of ancestral knowledge that you referred to in your last comment.
Yeah, so I grew up in a house with hundreds of plants inside and out. My mother loves plants. And my father, after he retired, also loved vegetable gardening. And so I grew up around plants, but quite frankly, I think none of us, I'm one of 5 kids, none of us showed any true interest in plants. My mom would say you have to water the plants, but we weren't truly interested in them. One of the first memories I have of being really interested in one is that she had one of these plants that would climb up the wall, and they would have these sticky holdfasts that would stick to the wall. So I was really interested not in the plant, but how it was smart enough to kind of plant itself on the wall. And really, as a young child, I was going to become a lawyer. I declared at 5 I was going to be a lawyer. All the aptitude tests that I took said I had everything. I love to debate. I love to write. But it was in middle school, 7th grade, I was really drawn to math and science. Still not plants, but drawn to math and science. And that's when the first kind of germ of teaching set in me. So I tell this story not out of pride, but to highlight the teacher. I was disruptive in 7th grade math class because I would get the topics quickly and start talking to all of my friends around me. And my 7th grade teacher, Mr. Cheatham, said to me, if you'll be quiet Monday to Thursday when you're done and just sit there and let everybody else learn, you can co-teach the class with me on Fridays. So literally, I co-taught 7th grade math all throughout 7th grade. And I really loved that, standing at the front of the room, helping people understand. But after that, I had a chance to start taking math and science classes. And so it was first a love for math and science. And much later, when I realized that you could have a career as a scientist, I took classes in ecology, plant anatomy, human anatomy, but plant physiology class woke me up to the magic of plants because even though I grew up surrounded by them, I thought they were pretty boring. They didn't move, they didn't play like puppies, they didn't move like animals. And that class really changed my perspective on it. And so that's when I really moved towards plants. And then the intuitive part of plants, lessons from plants, is the way my family shows up in the world. We are asked questions about what did you learn and how are you going to bring that knowledge back to community? So I always felt I had to bring this knowledge back to community in some way. That's the ancestral lineage I come from. And for me, that's shown up as lessons from plants.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What's really interesting in some ways, I see your story, your engagement with science and math as being kind of unique. There's a lot of data out there that suggests young people become disconnected to science as they move between as they move from kindergarten through, secondary, that somehow by middle school, they disengage with the sciences. And there's lots of data to suggest that. And in some ways, your story is a counter narrative. Outside of classes and maybe even, sort of your observations at home, were there other experiences, activities that really sort of activated your sensibilities and your interests in science?
Yes. So I think when I think outside of kind of the learning environment, back when I was young, so I'm the youngest of five. I have a sister who's 3 years older than me and a brother who's 3 years older than her. And every summer, from the time I was about 7 or so, we would go on adventures during the day. So my mom would feed us breakfast, and then we were supposed to be back home by lunch. And we would just roam the city. I was raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. This was a city. And we would go in the woods and we would find wild blackberries and eat them. And we would dig up other plants and we would notice things. So I think all the time I spent in nature also gave me this real deep fascination with plants. And so my mom started to teach us things because there was some poisonous oak that made berries that looked almost like blackberries. And my mom said that the poison oak has 3 leaflets and the wild blackberries have 5. So she taught us if there are 3, let it be, right? If you see 3, don't eat that. And so we would literally supplement our adventures by figuring out what we could eat and what time of year you would find them. And so that adventure really turned me on to nature. And it was later reflecting back that I remembered those kinds of adventures with my brothers and sisters and the learnings we started to get early about plants that I think show up now in the ways I think about plants, not just as scientific study beings, but organisms that were a part of my life, a part of my memories with my brother and sister, a part of teaching that my mom did from a cultural perspective.
And that brings me to something that I thought was so compelling in the introduction. And forgive me, I'm going to read here because I want to make sure I capture your eloquent commentary. You note, quote, the idea that plants, quote unquote, behave rather than passively existing or growing has only recently become more widely accepted among biologists, end quote. And in thinking about sort of the life of and the life cycle of plants, and seeing from this sort of vantage point, this idea of plants behave, do you see lessons from plants as an intervention in how we understand the ecology of plants?
I hope it will be. And when I say that, I think for years we've thought of plants as a set of biological or biochemical interactions, but there's so much intuitive nature of them understanding what's going on around them, whether they're close to neighbors or not. And are these happening through biological reactions? Yes, they are, but it's more than just a series of reactions. There is a knowing of when you're in a diverse community versus not. I think of some of the examples in the book and others where, when you have older trees growing with younger trees, the older tree serves as a nurse. It shares its excess. That's more than just an existing. That's you're in community with a being that's of a different age, and they all grow better together when there's this sharing and protection that's going on. So I really did hope to invite, I don't want us to see plants through the lens of how are they like us. I want us to be fascinated with the complexity and intuitive of nature of plants in and of themselves, not in the ways it confirms who we are as humans, but really for us to sit and ask, what can we learn about being more plant-like? I think too frequently as humans, we think about everything through the lens of how it's like us, how it confirms what we believe to be good about ourselves. And there's so much wisdom that indigenous cultures and others have taught us from sitting at the other end and asking, how are we more similar to other beings on the planet? And what responsibility do we then have when we understand that perspective?
Oh, that's such a powerful way to think about it, because I immediately thought about the personification of plants. And brother, what I hear you saying is that, you know, there's something we can learn from plants about being better human beings as well, yes, or being better habitats in this sort of ecosystem, if you will. And, you know, you mentioned indigenous plants and indigenous knowledge. And in particular, I thought chapter 5 was so fascinating in the ways in which you explore indigenous planting knowledge with a focus on the Three Sisters system. And per that chapter, this system highlights the beneficial effects of community interactions, right? And it suggests the wisdom of an ecosystem-based approach to promoting communication and supporting success. You also talk about sort of the power of partnering and reciprocal relationships. Can you expound, because I found that chapter so powerful. Can you expound on the Three Sister system, its ecological benefits, and the lessons we can learn from bringing together indigenous and scientific basis of knowledge?
Absolutely. So the Three Sisters is culturally a practice of indigenous people in the Americas. And, you know, I always like to start by saying I have been guided by and inspired by that knowledge and share it, not to co-opt it, but to share it as a lesson for us to consider. Having said that, you know, my own ancestors are from Africa, and there are likewise polyculture practices that happen amongst indigenous cultures around the world. And the Three Sisters is a very powerful representation of one of these polyculture, where you're growing multiple species of plants together. And I remember hearing this story when it impacted me most deeply. I was hearing a talk from Robin Wall-Kimmerer, a plant ecologist, an indigenous scholar who works in the SUNY system. And she was sharing this story, and I was sharing it with my mother, and my mother also pulled out a coloring sheet that she had kept from first or second grade, where I had been introduced to these Three Sisters. The Three Sisters are corn, bean, and squash, and it's really a story of reciprocity and collaboration. And I think it resonated so deeply with me because one of my own guiding life principles from my own ancestral lineage is reciprocity. When you receive, you must give. This whole idea of reciprocity. The Three Sisters are so powerful because each of them offers something to the other. The corn grows tall, reaching toward the sun for itself, but in reaching tall, it provides a scaffold for beans. Beans would otherwise grow along the ground and be subject to damage, but they're able to use the first sister as a support to lift themselves up, to limit their damage from growing along the ground. Beans are legumes and are able to collaborate with bacteria to fix nitrogen that's in the air into a liquid form. That's a liquid nutrient, a liquid fertilizer. So it makes some for itself, but it makes excess to share with the first sister and repaying this support that the first sister has provided. And then the third sister is squash, which grows low to the ground, sometimes toward the outside of these Three Sisters. And it really grows as a ground cover, keeping other weeds from coming in, keeping the ground moist. And so it provides this ground cover protection. It receives some of the nitrogen in response. And because it grows lower to the ground, the corn can provide some cover. So each of them is receiving something from one of the other sisters, but also giving back. And what we know, I always say we didn't need science to show this to us. Indigenous cultures have done this because it works. But science has in parallel shown that these plants are more productive and more resilient together than they are only growing with their own kind. And so for me, there were powerful lessons in that about reciprocity, but also powerful lessons that we need to be reminded of about the importance of diversity and how we thrive better together, not just with our own kind. And many humans are drawn towards homophily, where we're drawn to be with our own kind. But we know throughout nature and throughout history, throughout, evolution, that we are better when we bring together our diverse gifts and our diverse strengths, and also share in reciprocity so that our weaknesses don't really become a barrier for us. And so I am drawn to that story frequently as a lesson for me. I think one of the first papers I wrote, independent of the book, was thinking about, as a professor, we have research, service, and teaching that we're required to do. And we often think about those as competing for our time and attention. And early in my career, I asked, how could I think about them as three sisters that are feeding each other? How does my research make me a better teacher? How can I use my research in my service to take it to community? And in so doing, it really made me feel that I was synergizing my time, enriching my time, and enriching my work. I've thought about it in the personal when I'm being a mother, but I also need to be doing professional things. So when I'm going to Paris for a meeting, how can I take my son and allow him to have a cultural experience? So I think there's so many lessons for us to learn in the personal, professional, and in community from natural occurrences like the Three Sisters.
Wow. And when I think about lessons from plants, what you just articulated is embodied in the book. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, and you sort of answered it, was, you frame your engagement with plants in some ways as this enchantment with plants, which I think is so beautiful. And I wanted to know, how does that enchantment translate into sort of your research agenda? And I really appreciate you sort of saying they're not bifurcated, right? That they are indeed a dialectic. They are in conversation with one another. But how has that enchantment with plants, informed the research agenda?
Yeah, so it has informed my research agenda in so many ways. And, I have been fortunate to be funded by the National Science Foundation and other organizations that are funded by taxpayer dollars. And we're often asked as scientists to talk about how we've used that money to enrich the lives of so many people. And so many scientists go to, what I've learned about plants is going to improve agriculture. It's going to improve commercial use of plants. And some of the work that I've done likely will do that. But the ways in which I'm enchanted with plants I have asked myself, how am I using the knowledge that I've learned from plants to enrich the lives of those students and postdocs who've agreed to work with me, the students whom I get to talk about my work with in the classroom, the collaborators who gift their time. And so for me, I really do try to ask questions that advance scientific knowledge about plants. But every research experiment or series of experiments that we do, we also as a group ask, what have we learned about ourselves from conducting these experiments? Not a lot of my colleagues do that. I mean, it's not the way we're trained as scientists to ask that kind of question. But in so doing, it's made me a better mentor. It's made me a better leader. It's made me a better collaborator. So the enchantment with plants as teachers, as offering knowledge, not just to advance my own career, has changed the kind of scientist, mentor, and leader I am, the kind of collaborator I am as well.
That segues into my next question, really. One of the things that you talk about with such clarity in Lessons from Plants is, mentorship and faculty development, and the, sort of the cultivation of a evidence-based strategy to foster equity and inclusion in academia. Can you elaborate a bit on your work in the realm of equity and inclusion, and in what ways can evidence-based strategies to deepen equity and inclusion within academic environments, how do you move that forward within the sciences, within academia? What unique perspective does it add to the discourse?
I think about two trains of thought that I spend a lot of time thinking about. I'll start with the first one about the evidence base and end with the one that's related to plants. But when I first started my own research group in 2004 at Michigan State, you get an empty lab and you got to fill it up with equipment and people and ideas. And I have 100 new ideas every other day. I was excited about the ideas. And buying equipment is fun. I had money, I was shopping through catalogs. When I realized the responsibility I had for mentoring people, I really wanted to do that with responsibility and deep care. And so for me, I took the approach that scientists take when they're going to do a new experiment that they've never done before. Most of us, if we decide we're going to do a new experiment, whether it's making the vaccine, right, for COVID, you don't just start and do it by happenstance. You look in the literature and see who's done something similar. What can you learn from what they've done? Where do you need to innovate? Because it's something so new that you need to innovate. But we often innovate starting from a base of knowledge and evidence. And so I had not seen us as scientists doing that with mentoring. Most of us entered mentoring doing what was done to us, never having read a paper on it, never being formally trained. And so I asked the question of how our mentoring would change if we used the practices we knew worked when we were going to start a new line of experiment. And so for me, I went to the literature and found that there was a lot of literature from people in education and sociology and psychology about what works to have effective STEM mentoring. And I simply used Boyer's, we often talk about the scholarship of teaching. I use the scholarship of integration, where that's where there's knowledge available, but you integrate it into a new framework. So I started to bring that knowledge into my own practices and then into communities of other scientists to say we can do better. While I was doing that, I also realized there were some powerful lessons from plants on mentoring. And that's the fact that the vast majority of humans on the planet believe that plants should grow. If you have a plant in your home, you believe that it should be green and healthy. And if it's not, you ask questions about what does it need? Does it need water? Does it need new soil? Does it need nutrients? Or are you the problem? Do you need improved caretaking skills? And when I thought about that, engaging with the being from the expectation of growth allows you not to blame the plant. If the plant's suffering, we don't say the plant, oh, this plant is incapable of growing. We ask, what do we need to do? And simply asking people to take that ability that humans have towards plants and ask how it would transform our spaces. If we came into an expectation with students, with colleagues, with our children, with our family, that growth can happen, how would that change how we interacted with them? Started to lend itself to some powerful lessons on mentoring. And so between the two of those, that's how I really got deep into asking questions and trying to do scholarship and interventions to ask, can we do better? I've seen too many students come through with a degree and they're damaged, and I don't want to contribute to that anymore.
That is such a powerful testament to your prowess as a leader, as a scholar, and certainly as a mentor. I feel really honored to have that model presented here this evening, and I'm sure others on our program also fully appreciate that model of leadership and mentorship. So thank you. You know, one of the questions that has been in my head, particularly as it relates to the pandemic, and in some ways, your book couldn't have been published at a more right time. For many, including myself, I developed, to use your framework, sort of a kinship, if you will, with plants over the last 2 years. And I wonder if the discourse around plant care and engagement and enchantment with plants has evolved over the last 2 years based on the conversations that you're having with others. Have you seen a difference in the ways in which people engage with plants and the care, that sort of care culture that you refer to? Has that changed during the pandemic? I'm just wondering.
I think so. And I'm smiling because I remember when the pandemic came upon us and it was clear my book was coming out during the pandemic, I was so disappointed because I had all the dreams of being in the bookstore, signing books, and it ended up being a gift from the sense that one of the first things that happened during the pandemic was this explosion in interest in houseplants. And I started to see on social media everywhere, friends of mine and others growing lettuce from the scraps of a lettuce head and using green onions and scallions to regrow them. I think there was this fascination with growing houseplants, and also for some people, a fear that I might have to grow all my own food because we really didn't know what was going to happen. And that real interest in houseplants just exploded at a time that the book came out, right? And so many of the conversations when we were talking earlier about who I expected to read the book, some of the invitations I've had to, I had the great gift of having a science communication conversation with Alan Alda. I was just enthralled, right? Because he has this podcast. It was so cute because of all the talks I've done, my mom says, I know him. My mom's 80. She said, oh, I know him. This is great. But there were also just a common interest from gardeners. And I think that one of the reasons the interest in houseplants grew is that we have a need as humans to take care of something. And many of us shut away in our homes during the pandemic. Not all of us could have a pet. Some of us were home alone. My son was away at college. And so plants were something that almost anybody could bring into their space and pour their care into. And the great thing about plants is that even though I thought they were boring growing up, if you're a houseplant grower and that new leaf emerges, you get so excited when you see a new leaf. And so you see the material evidence of the care. And when it's not going well and they start to yellow and wilt, you're reminded that you didn't care for them. So I think there was an explosion, and it was serendipity for me that I got to have lots of conversations around it.
Awesome. Well, in chapter 2, since we're talking about sort of the life of plants and the ways in which we communicate with them and how they communicate with us. In chapter 2, you really talk about the plant's ability to discern. And that is my sort of reading of what you argue. You suggest that plants engage in risk assessment.
Yes.
And I found that to be particularly interesting in terms of thinking about their ability to discern, their ability to gauge and make sense of their environment. Can you talk a bit about that particular dimension of plants and their life cycle?
Absolutely. That was one of the most fascinating things I started to learn about plants myself, is how good they are at calculating risk. And part of that is because plants, unlike humans, we're born with the organs we have, and we grow a little taller, a little wider, a little, but for plants, they're making new organs, new leaves, new roots throughout their life. And it's costly to make a new leaf. So to commit to making a new leaf before you're sure you have the sunlight, the water, the nutrients to support it, you really have to weigh risk. And we were talking before this about how we're going through this period in some parts of the country where it's cold one day and it's warm the next day. It's a risk for plants to set out their new blooms in spring. And so they have to weigh the risk. If it's warm, is it warm long enough for me to take the risk to put the energy into putting this out? Or do I need to wait a little bit to make sure it's completely spring? So plants are able to do fascinating mathematics about the number of days it's been warm. And if it's been warm enough days, then they say, okay, it's likely it's going to stay warm. I've done the math, I've counted this up. They're able to also, as you said, discern. And so often plants are having to decide, for example, tomato plants, if they're being attacked by hornworms, they have to make a decision whether they use their energy to defend themselves or do they continue to make new leaves and new fruits. And so they weigh this very carefully to ask, well, how many hornworms are there? If it's just going to be a little damage, maybe it's a better risk to make a new leaf. Where if there's a true infestation, you might need to stop making leaves and protect everything that you have. And so they're constantly weighing these decisions, and using their energy budget to decide how much energy do I have this month? Can I do both of these? And as I love to say when I'm talking with students, this is a plant. If you're Oprah Winfrey's daughter, you can make different decisions than if you're my daughter, because when the money's done at the end of the month over here, you have to wait until the next paycheck comes. And so plants are really saying, how much energy, what's my budget? And once I've made a certain set of decisions, I have to make different decisions. And so it's really fascinating to watch at the scientific level, because we can see it at the molecular level, how they're making these decisions, but to see those decisions happening all around us is quite fascinating.
Awesome. And every chapter has, this didactic contour, just like what you've shared with us in that response. I think I want to make sure that we leave time for our audience, but my final question is really, again, You incorporate some fantastic quotes, one of which is from Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. And you use the quote, humans have the least experience with how to live and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among the other species for guidance. Their wisdom is apparent in the way that they live. They teach us by example, end quote.
Yes.
While your book clearly offers so many lessons humans can gather from plants, what is the greatest lesson plants have taught you to date?
Oh, that is, I think one of the greatest lessons that plants have taught me, I think immediately about my son, because I'm like most mothers and just think he's the most amazing person on the planet. And I have watched him towards the end of the book. I talk about the fact that when he was young, we planted a tree for him. He has his own tree. And he watches that tree. He's been watching it. He's now 19. And over the years, the tree would be taller than him, or he would be taller than the tree. And we would draw lessons from that. I think one of the lessons plants have taught me is how rich our lives can be if we see beings like plants as our kin, and organisms that we can have an ongoing relationship with, that we can grow with, that we can care for, that they care for us at times. I think about the tree. His tree is now tall enough that it casts a little bit of shade. And so in the summer, we sit under his tree and read a book. So it protects us. And so I really believe that plants have taught me to open up my own idea of my place on the planet. And what it means, not just to feel that I'm here to extract whatever I can, but that I am in reciprocal relationships with all beings on the planet, and how that changes the way I show up in the world. Plants have taught me that more than any other organism on the planet.
Wow. I'm almost speechless, because you just reminded me of how plants can teach us to never have a poverty of imagination. That was so beautiful. We are going to turn to our Q&A in just a second, but I just received news that we've identified 3 people who will be recipients of the fantastic lessons from plants. If you'll give me just a second, I will list those names of the winners: Lucas Delia, Jane Levy, and John Zuzman. Again, that's Lucas Dilio, Jane Levy, and John Zuzman. Congratulations on being the winners of our raffle. You will not be able to put this down. Again, there are so many lessons to learn here. And we look forward to you having an opportunity to experience this incredible book by the wonderful Dr. Montgomery. At this time, I'd like to turn our attention to the Q&A. Our audience have all kinds of great questions.
Awesome.
LaVon Roberson writes, Dr. Montgomery, quote unquote, plants as kin. How amazing to hear this from you, a plant biologist. Can you talk more about that kinship? How inclusive is that kin?
Awesome. First of all, hello, LaVon. I came to know her after she became fascinated with the book. And so it's nice that she's here. One of the things I talk about in the book is what plants have taught me about the limited ways in which we as humans define kin. Thinking about how plants have kinship with other plants. Plants have kinship with bacteria. As I told you, beans have a kinship with bacteria to fix nitrogen. Really, as humans, we often have very narrow definitions of kin. As all humans, we should be kin, but often we define kin by people with whom we share the same socioeconomic status. We define kin by people with whom we share the same zip code. And we see that because we protect those who we see as kin and alienate and set aside those who we don't see as kin. And so for me, I have tried to take kin as the most inclusive definition. If we are all living organisms on the same planet, at some level we share kinship. Am I closer kin with my siblings? Yes. But I believe that plants are my kin. Even the organisms that I'm not drawn to. I'm not drawn to termites, but termites have a place on the planet. right? And so for me, I have to challenge myself. I have to remind myself, but I try to have the most inclusive definition of kin, but I also try to remind myself how so many ills we have in the world, climate change, poverty, sexism, all of these isms are because we set up these false definitions of who is kin and who is not kin. And that determines how we engage, who we include, who we exclude. And so I think we have to challenge ourselves daily to expand our definitions of kin.
Wow. And actually Chuck Wolf's question is a very much synergistic with your response. He writes, a wonderful dialogue. As I'm listening, I'm thinking about how the life lessons, plant lessons, and your use of asking what can we learn from plants should be taught in Harvard Business and Graduate School of Education. And what can we learn from plants that will help us to have a more emotionally intelligent culture, which embraces diversity and inclusivity. What do you think?
I have had some really amazing discussions with people in areas far from who I thought would be drawn to it. So I have certainly had some discussions with business leaders, but I think back to a few years ago, I was invited to engage lessons from plants on mentoring and leadership with the American Economics Association. And I have good friends who are economists, but I wasn't sure how the economists were going to be drawn to my plant lessons. They were not the audience who I thought would be most receptive. And yet they were largely receptive because it does force us to rethink how it's just very powerful to understand that when I say most humans think plants should grow, most of us are thinking, yep, you're absolutely right. I do believe if a plant's in my space, it should grow. And if it's not, it's because I need to give it some water. It really challenges us to rethink these kind of artificial barriers that we've set up. And so I do think there are power from lessons from plants. But the thing that I have challenged people, lessons from plants resonate so deeply because it's my passion and my love, and I bring that. I think all of us have lessons we can bring. I was talking to a group of criminal justice professors and students, and I believe that criminal justice professors have something to bring to cultural change. They know how to tease apart a situation, figure out the causative nature of such things. If we brought those skills, it would help. I think all of us have passions we can bring to really changing our society so that they serve a greater proportion of us well, if that's what we decide. And when we all show up with our enthusiasm and knowledge and share that through a reciprocal lens, I believe we could get quite far. But I, of course, I'm biased that yes, lessons from plants have some power for all of those discussions.
Dr. Montgomery, like in your view, do you think being in kinship with plants has this uncanny ability to inspire empathy? Because I feel like there's such a dearth of empathy. And when I think about my own relationship with plants, I'm reminded of my own humanity. When I see a plant that is not doing well, I'm like, it's a reflection of not only me as the caretaker, but it's a reflection of where I am right now and whether or not I'm being a good steward of caring for my plants. And so I wonder if that kinship is also a metonym, if you will, for empathy.
I do think it really does allow us to think deeply about empathy. For me, it's empathy as well as re-understanding our place on the planet. So we are often blind to plants. We just don't pay attention to them. And, or we do it from a very self-centered lens. So we think, I love the smell of roses, right? I do. That scent is not for me. That's the language of the rose attracting its bee to be pollinated or attracting, I get to benefit from it. But I think too frequently we think about plants from how they serve us. And part of this, I think, is to invite us to have more empathy, but also to re-ask about how are we elevating our own space on the planet. The core gift that I have to remind myself is that if plants disappear from the planet tomorrow, I have a few minutes or a few hours to live. If I disappear from the planet tomorrow, the plants might have a party. They will go on. And so who really holds the power in the relationship that we have with plants? We don't understand our place on this planet relative to plants. So it is about empathy, but I think it's also about us redefining how important we see ourselves on the planet versus how important we might actually be and who can exist without the other.
Powerful. Anna Maria asked the question, how do you suggest urban children who don't get the same opportunities you had in your childhood to explore nature, get immersed in it today?
So I think that there's a lot of great work that's been happening in urban environments and also, quite frankly, in the prison system to really introduce children or others who don't have the freedom of movement to the just the love of plants, the interaction with plants, what we get from interacting. So I have had the privilege to be a part of some work in some urban spaces where we do container gardening with children. And so you can put a container garden almost anywhere. There's also been a lot of work in Detroit reclaiming abandoned lots and turning them into community gardens. And so these are beautiful ways to allow kids to have interactions with nature in their own environment, even as you address problems like food deserts. And so there's so many ways that there are multiple positive outcomes that come from this. And so I think that there are a lot of ways to bring nature into urban environments so that kids remain safe, but they still have the opportunity to grow in ways that were clearly transformative for my own upbringing.
Mm-hmm. Trenton asked the question, what's your favorite thing about making this book?
You know, I think the favorite thing about making this book is that the conversations that it has brought forward. I couldn't have even imagined the wide range of conversations that I've had and the opportunities to hear from others about what their interactions have been with plants. You know, as I'm clearly sold that plants are amazing, but it's been really amazing to have the opportunity to have conversations. The other thing that's been really rewarding is, you know, when a book comes out, sometimes you're invited to write a little 200 or 600 article just to promote the book. And I got to write two such articles. One was in Elle, where I got to reflect on my father passed and I planted some tulips and really the role that plants played in helping me walk through grief. And then just recently, a couple of weeks ago, I had an article come out on lessons on healing from trees, right? And so this idea of being able to explore topics that are healing and grief are something we're dealing with globally because of the pandemic. And to be able to show up in those conversations and use plant knowledge to try to have interesting conversations. It's the conversations that have been the greatest outcome for me.
Wow. Angela has a very thoughtful response. She writes, this is truly exciting. Thank you for this fantastic exchange. I came to this talk because my very amateur love of plants. As a social scientist and as a feminist political theorist in particular, I have a question about the use of nature for lessons about social life. Historically, arguments based in nature have been politically debilitating for some social groups, including women. Might the lessons that plants can teach us be conditioned by our social histories and political realities? In other words, might diversity among plant biologists push plant biology further because the social knowledge bases that scientists bring to the science actually change what is seen in the biology itself?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we see evidence of that. I think it was last week or two, I was able to have a conversation with Jessica Hernandez, who's an indigenous scientist who has a new book out called Fresh Banana Leaves. And clearly her indigenous perspectives have influenced the way she looks at environmental justice and environmental science. And I think that's one of the lessons I most wanted to come out of this. And so Jessica Hernandez, another friend of mine, Chanda Prescott Weinstein, has a book out, The Disordered Cosmos. She's an astrophysicist talking about her experience as a Black woman. And I think exactly what Angela said is true. And one of the reasons we need to have those conversations is that I think too frequently, I even myself, when I was younger, thought if you wanted to be an activist, if you wanted to advance Black feminist theory, you probably had to go into social sciences. You had to go through some kind of political scientist. And what I hope the work of Jessica, myself, Chanda, and others show is that plant biology, astrophysics, environmental science can be the path towards understanding societies better, if that's the view you come to it with. And so for me, certainly I'm a plant biochemist to understand plant biochemistry, but part of my career goal is to ask how this understanding of plant biochemistry can help us be better societies. That's not the lens most people bring to their plant biochemistry. But if by the time I retire, there's one young Black woman who says she's studying science to do Black feminist work, I want that to be a possibility, that science is the path to Black feminist work. Science is the path towards feminist understanding of society and social paradigms and social issues. And so I think that we have to have more diverse voices in those spaces to see those many different paths. And then we have to make space to hear them and learn from them. So I hope I responded in part to Angela's inquiry.
Well, Dr. Montgomery, to build on that, I wonder if the way that you are positing plants and what we learn from them, it does feel like an intervention, particularly when we think about, using a Black feminist framework to sort of, situate oneself in the world of science and in the world of plant biology. But so often when we talk about justice, particularly for BIPOC communities, it's often through a very narrow lens of maybe race and gender, but to think about the environment, to think about climate change, to think about some of these other dimensions, the broader ecosystem. I think one of the things you're suggesting is that this is a deeply important part of a social justice paradigm.
Absolutely. I truly believe that. And I have said to some of my colleagues that I'm really proud of some of the biochemistry work that we've published from my group over the almost 20 years I've been at Michigan State. But this book is one of the things I'm most proud of, not for the attention it's brought to me, but the idea that our science is about us learning how to be better people. It's not just about getting the accolades. And my mom loves to hear the accolades. But the accolades for me are not about the accolades. It's about a bigger platform to talk about how plants can make us better people, right? So for me, my pursuit of science is a social justice pursuit. It's a scholarly pursuit, but I need the scholarship to talk knowledgeably about plants to then draw you to the lessons. And so I do believe that there's so much work we have to do to understand how so many paths can be the paths towards social justice. And that's the biggest thing we need of our time. Do we need another plant biochemistry paper? It's always nice to know, but we actually need to be better as plant biochemists more than we need more plant biochemistry knowledge. And that's my goal. That's my path.
Wow. Mr. Bunster, as a landscape architect, I've been taught to promote the biophilic value of plants. How does biophilia correspond to the lessons you talk about?
I think it's pretty clear that, my lessons are drawn on the love and the positive side. One of the things I think about, one of my plant biochemist colleagues said, but there's so much competition and horrible things that plants do too. Yeah, all organisms have some less than stellar, behaviors that happen. There are carnivorous plants. There are, all kinds of plants in nature. But I do think that to get to the answers for some of the biggest problems of our time, climate change, food insecurity, poverty, we've got to increase our love of organisms. We need to start with our love of each other, but also our love of everything that's on the planet. So I do think that getting people drawn into the enthusiasm and enchantment is a path towards the lessons I hope to share.
Wow. Margaret, the questions are so robust. My goodness. Margaret asked, Dr. Montgomery, thank you for this wonderful discussion. My question is, do you think that plants can pick up on your energy field, and specifically, do they react to our emotional state?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm not dodging the question, but whenever I get that question, my true first response is, what does it mean to us if plants understand our emotions? And I think plants certainly are aware. I remember when I was 5 years old, my mom and some of her friends talked to their plants, right? They had these emotional connections with their plants. And I was a precocious little 5-year-old who had seen something on contact, 1, 2, 3 contact. And I said, it's not your talking, it's the extra carbon dioxide that you're giving as you're talking to them. But if my thing is, we think of emotions as a gift. We share emotions between humans as a gift. If the gift plants receive from us is carbon dioxide, that's a gift of love, right? And so I think sometimes we have to not box ourselves into the words that define how we think about how we interact as humans, but ask, do plants receive our gifts and are they appreciative of them? I believe that they do. And their appreciation shows through new leaves. It shows through continued living with us. But I try not to get myself too narrowly defined about definitions. Emotions are a type of gift that humans share, and plants and humans likewise share gifts. They just may have different names and different characteristics.
Hmm. Audrey asked a really interesting question here in the thread. Do we know the contributions of traditional knowledge of peoples from Africa to the success of the plantations in the South?
So I am smiling because I'm fascinated with that. I had the great privilege in June of 2020, after the tragic death of Breonna, and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and others. The Black science community came out and started a number of weeks. There was a Black Birders Week. There was a Black in Chemistry Week. I have been a part for the last 2 years, had the great honor and privilege to be a part of Black Botanist Week. And part of what we have done in those past 2 weeks is to explore Black botanical legacy, both legacy of people who got their degrees before us, but also this idea that many enslaved Africans weren't just brought because they were strong. They were brought because they had advanced botanical knowledge. And so I think there's a lot we have yet to learn about what that knowledge was, how it was either used or misused in terms of stealing these people from their own lands. There's a lot of work to do there. And there are many Black botanists, I think. What I get excited about is that these new conversations we're having makes that a feasible field of study for some people who haven't seen that in the past. So.
Yeah, and I think about, I think is it Julia Carney's work on the botanical legacies of the transatlantic trade, and also in thinking about rice, for instance, and the rice technologies bought from West Africa to places like Charleston, South Carolina. It deeply informed sort of the plantocracy as it's understood. So that's a really important discussion to be had for sure. Thank you for that question, and thanks for your thoughtful answer, Dr. Montgomery. Gosh, we have so many great questions. Let's see, given how large the plant world is, how did you choose what to focus on in your research? And what is your research currently? And this is from Mary Lou.
I'm smiling because some of my colleagues will say I haven't chosen to focus. So one of the reasons I'm in academia as opposed to working in industry is that I had very good friends who work in industry, and they would come home and say their project has changed because it was no longer economically feasible. And I get emotionally attached to most everything I work on. So right now in my lab, we work on projects that I started in the 1990s as a graduate student, projects I started as a postdoc. Generally, we're interested in one question, and that's how plants are able to sense changes in their light and nutrient environment, and how they use that information to tell them what behaviors they should be exhibiting. So plants use light cues. If it's a long series of short days and cold temperatures combined, they know it's winter, it's time to rest. When that pattern changes, they know they're moving into spring and it's time to flower. So we're very interested in how that perception of light and nutrient and temperature gets translated into behaviors. But ultimately, I say that the question I'm asking across all the many different projects in my lab, we also study bacteria. I study mentoring, write papers on mentoring and leadership. Ultimately, I'm interested in how organisms have a sense of who they are, where they are, and what they should be doing to promote success and limit damage. And for me, that's true of plants. That's true of people in terms of mentoring relationships. I'm very interested in identity, self-actualization, how that translates into behaviors that lead you away from danger and towards success. And so those are the kinds of questions we ask across a number of biological organisms, including humans.
Mm-hmm. And I'll ask one more question. Ida had a question about, she said, what do you do, Beronda, to ensure green spaces remain healthy?
So I think part of it has to be awareness. That's one of the reasons I so am drawn to having conversations about us understanding our place to have a relationship with plants and be aware of them. And you have to be aware of green spaces and have an ongoing interaction with them to know when they're healthy and when that health is slipping, right? And so if you're a gardener, that means you can't just plant your plants in June and come back in November and harvest tomatoes. You have to check on them daily. So part of, really having healthier or green spaces is integrating them in our lives in ways that we have regular interactions with them, sharing knowledge. As I told you, I'm a plant biologist by training. My mom is a botanist by her intuitive nature of growing plants over the years. So we have to have people in community who are what I think of as environmental stewards. They're the ones who have the knowledge, whether trained or intuitive, to understand when health is good and when health is bad. But all of us have to have a commitment to be aware and to have some contribution. If your contribution is financial, to make sure that there's fertilizer and clean water, that's your contribution. If your contribution is knowledge and intuition, but there has to be some kind of collective engagement in the spaces and ongoing understanding of how we interact with them, how we impact them, and vice versa.
Wow. I am so full. This has been such a rich discussion. Dr. Montgomery, thank you so much for your time and energy. Thank you for gifting the world lessons from plants. I think we have so much to learn from what you've given us. We greatly appreciate the wisdom that you endowed this program with this evening, and just appreciate both how you model scientific inquiry and the multiple ways in which you have invited us to think more thoughtfully about plants and the broader ecosystem to which we all belong. You are just a superstar. Thank you so very much. And thank you to our captive audience. You've asked great questions, and we will be sure to share those questions with Dr. Montgomery for her review. Again, if you're interested in more programs from our wonderful season, visit us at www.hmsc.harvard.edu. We look forward to seeing you at the next program. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.